The wind began its low, mournful howl as the group of mountaineers gathered at the base of the peak. There were 6 of them. Will, the unofficial leader with years of experience etched into his weathered face. Maria, a geology professor with an unshakable calm. Eric, a thrill-seeker always chasing the next adrenaline rush. Lucy, a photographer whose lens captured the raw beauty of nature. Tom, the quiet but dependable medic. And Claire, a last-minute addition to the team, whose sharp eyes and reserved demeanor hinted at secrets. The plan was straightforward: ascend the mountain, document the journey, and return within 3 days. But the weather, as Will had warned, was always unpredictable. By midday, the first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and harmless at first, like whispers from the sky. Eric laughed, throwing his arms wide and spinning in circles. "A little snow never hurt anyone," he declared. But Will's expression remained serious as he scanned the horizon. The clouds were thickening, turning the sky into a slate-gray void. The group pressed on, their boots crunching through the fresh powder. Spirits were high despite the biting cold, and Lucy snapped photos at every opportunity, her camera clicking like a metronome. Maria pointed out unusual rock formations, her voice steady and confident, a balm against the encroaching silence. Claire stayed at the back, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as the storm grew heavier. By nightfall, they reached a plateau and set up camp. The wind had picked up, rattling the tent walls like skeletal fingers. They huddled together, their laughter forced, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. The storm was worsening, and with it came a strange sensation, as if the mountain itself was alive, watching, waiting. It was Eric who first heard the voices. He had stepped outside to relieve himself, the snow swirling around him in a chaotic dance. As he zipped up his jacket, a faint sound caught his ear. It was distant, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable, his name, called softly. "Eric." He froze, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking. There was no answer, only the wind and the relentless snow. Shaking his head, he returned to the tent, chalking it up to his imagination. But the seed of unease had been planted. The night passed fitfully. The howling wind seemed to carry whispers, and more than once, someone jolted awake, convinced they'd heard their name. Will dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a combination of stress and the storm. But the group couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By morning, the storm had worsened, transforming the landscape into a blinding white expanse. Visibility was near zero, and the cold was merciless. Will made the call to stay put and wait for the weather to clear. It was a logical decision, but it also meant more time trapped in the eerie silence, with nothing to distract them from the voices that now seemed to come more frequently. Maria was the next to hear it. She was collecting snow samples a few yards from the camp when she heard her name, soft and insistent. "Maria." It came from the direction of the woods, a dark line of trees barely visible through the swirling snow. Heart pounding, she took a step closer, the rational part of her mind screaming to stop. But the voice was so familiar, so comforting. It sounded like her late father. When she returned to the tent, pale and trembling, she didn't tell the others what she had heard. She wasn't sure they would believe her. And deep down, she didn't want to admit that she had almost followed it. The second day brought no relief. The storm raged on, and with it came a growing sense of dread. The voices were no longer isolated incidents. Each member of the group had heard their name, called in tones that varied from pleading to commanding. Worse, the voices seemed to know things, intimate details that no one outside the group could possibly know. Lucy heard her mother's voice, the one she hadn't heard since she was a child. It called to her with the same gentle lilt, urging her to step outside the tent. "Lucy, come here. It's safe out here." She clutched her camera tightly, her knuckles white, as if the device could somehow protect her. Tom, usually stoic, confessed that he'd heard the voice of his brother, who had died in a climbing accident years ago. "He said he was waiting for me," Tom murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. "He said he'd found a way out." Claire remained silent, but her darting eyes and tight-lipped expression spoke volumes. She, too, had heard something, but whatever it was, she wasn't sharing. Will tried to keep the group focused, his commanding tone a thin veneer over his own growing fear. "This mountain plays tricks on people," he said. It's the altitude, the isolation. It messes with your head. But even he couldn't explain why the voices were so specific, so tailored to each of them. By nightfall, the tension was palpable. They took turns keeping watch, though none of them felt truly awake or asleep. During his shift, Eric swore he saw a figure moving in the snow, just beyond the camp. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it in the direction, but there was nothing there. Just the snow and the shadows. But the footprints were real. When morning came, they found a trail of them leading away from the camp and into the woods. The prints were human, barefoot, and impossibly fresh. Panic set in as the group debated their next move. Staying put was no longer an option. The storm showed no signs of abating, and their supplies were dwindling. Will decided they would follow the footprints, reasoning that they might lead to another group or a shelter. No one voiced their doubts, though unease clung to them like a second skin. The trail led them deeper into the woods, the trees like skeletal sentinels against the blizzard. The voices grew louder, more persistent, as if the storm itself was speaking to them. Maria's steps faltered as she heard her father again, his voice tinged with desperation. "Maria, please. Don't leave me here." Eric, always the risk-taker, began to stray from the group, drawn by a voice that promised adventure and glory. "Eric, come find me," it urged. Will had to physically pull him back, shouting over the wind to snap him out of his trance. As night fell, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, half buried in snow. Relief was short-lived. The interior was cold and barren, with signs that someone had been there recently. A fire pit was still warm, and a journal lay open on a makeshift table. The entries were scrawled in a shaky hand, detailing a similar experience. Voices in the storm, luring people away. The last entry read, "Don't listen. Don't follow." The group's unity began to fracture as the voices exploited their fears and desires. Lucy's obsession with capturing the perfect shot led her to venture outside alone, chasing what she swore was a figure in the snow. When the others found her, she was half buried in a snowdrift, her camera clutched to her chest. She was alive but unresponsive, her eyes wide with terror. Tom's pragmatism wavered as he heard his brother's voice again, calling him to fix what you couldn't before. He began to question his own sanity, wondering if the mountain was giving him a chance at redemption. Claire finally broke her silence, revealing that she had come to the mountain for answers. Her sister had vanished on a similar expedition years ago, and the last transmission had mentioned the voices. Claire was convinced that the mountain held the truth, but now she wasn't sure she wanted to know it. Will struggled to keep the group together, but even he wasn't immune. He heard his wife's voice, soft and accusing, reminding him of the promise he'd broken years ago. "You left me," it whispered. "Why did you leave me?" As the storm reached its peak, the group found themselves drawn to a clearing at the heart of the woods. The voices were deafening now, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. In the center of the clearing stood a monolithic structure, its surface covered in strange, otherworldly symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light. The voices emanated from the structure, each one distinct, pulling at their deepest fears and desires. Eric was the first to approach. His eyes glazed over as he reached out to touch the stone. The others shouted for him to stop, but their voices were drowned out by the storm. When Eric's hand made contact, the ground trembled, and the air grew impossibly cold. The monolith seemed to absorb him, his body dissolving into the stone like mist. The voices grew louder, more frenzied, as if feeding off his sacrifice. Panic set in as the remaining members tried to flee, but the storm closed in, the snow turning to ice that encased their feet. One by one, they succumbed to the voices, their bodies disappearing into the monolith. Will was the last, his defiance giving way to despair as his wife's voice called to him, promising forgiveness and peace. As he stepped forward, he realized too late that the voices were not his loved ones but something ancient and malevolent, using their memories as bait. The storm abated with the dawn, leaving the mountain eerily silent. The monolith stood alone in the clearing, its surface smooth and unmarked, as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the group's existence was a single, weathered photograph left behind in the snow, a picture of 6 friends, smiling at the base of the peak, unaware of the horrors that awaited them.